بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله السلام عليكم. Peace be to everybody, brothers and sisters and friends, and welcome to today's live stream. A civil discussion, a philosophical discussion, maybe a theo-philosophical discussion on the topic of freedom of speech. And I don't hopefully need to introduce myself. My name is Hamza Tzortzis, and I'm a research student at the University of London studying philosophy. And we have with us a respected thinker and a respected guest, Dr. Stephen Law. I'm going to briefly introduce him, but I want him to tell us his story because it's quite inspirational, I think, especially from an academic point of view. So Dr. Stephen, he's formerly reader in philosophy at Heythrop College, University of London. He's published various books in philosophy and has a new course on critical thinking at Udemy. And he has an interesting story. He was once a postman. Now he's a philosophical postman in a way that not only does he deliver the philosophical message, but he writes the letters himself. So I'm not going to get into it too much. Let Stephen introduce himself to the audience. Take your time, Stephen.
Hi. Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. You're right. I used to be a postman a long time ago. I was a postman for about 4 years, actually, in Cambridge. And the reason I became a postman was because I wasn't sure what to do with my life. I'd had a couple of attempts at doing A-levels, and the first time I was asked to leave, and the second time I just gave up because I just found it so pointless, really. And so I ended up doing various manual jobs. I was a manual labourer on the M11 when that was built. And then I became a postman for about 4 years. And then eventually I discovered philosophy. I would read a lot. One book would lead to another. And eventually I found I was reading nothing but philosophy books. And then I realized that actually this was what I was really passionate about. And I applied to get into university to study philosophy once I realized you could do that. And by some miracle, I still don't really understand how I did it, but I managed to convince the City University in London to take me on as an undergraduate.
This is without A-levels, right?
Without the A-levels, yeah. Without even an access course or anything. I was very fortunate. So I did really well. So I got a first, and then I went to Oxford to do the B.Phil, which is what everyone does if they want to teach, almost everyone. And then I did my doctorate there. And then I was a research fellow for 3 years at Queen's College, Oxford. Then I got a job in the University of London, a college called Heythrop, which was closed down recently. And I took early retirement, but I spent most of my career there. And that actually, Heythrop is a strange place because it was founded by the Jesuits, the Catholics, the intellectual branch of the Catholics, and it was founded in Belgium, and then it moved around a lot, and at one time it was located in a village called Heythrop in Oxfordshire, which is where it got the name, and then it ended up in about 1975 as part of the University of London, at which point it was the newest member of the University of London, but the oldest college, funnily enough, in the University of London. And then I was very happy there, and I enjoyed working with the Jesuits. It was a very liberal, tolerant place. My philosophical interests tend to be in things like philosophy of mind, metaphysics, especially Wittgenstein. I'm really keen on the later philosophy of Wittgenstein. A chap called Kripke. But then I've also become more interested, maybe it was the Jesuits, maybe the influence rubbed off, but I ended up becoming more interested in religion, philosophy of religion. I'm not a religious person. I'm an atheist. Probably admit that up front. I'm an atheist, but not always. I think early on I was quite religiously inclined. My father was going to be a religious minister. There's a recording of me about age 2 singing "Onward Christian Soldiers," apparently. And then, although I wasn't really very religious, I was kind of drawn to new agey, hippy-dippy stuff for a while in my early 20s. But as I became exposed to more and more Western philosophy, that kind of drifted away, to be honest. I'm much more skeptical about that stuff. now. But I became interested in religion for all sorts of reasons, and I've published various papers in philosophy of religion, some of which created a bit of a stir. And I'm probably best known for having just published lots of introductory books. So there's a book for children called The Complete Philosophy Files, which I still like very much. There's a book for adults called The Philosophy Gym, 25 Short Adventures in Thinking. And then I wrote a book on humanism for Oxford University Press, and lots of other books too. So that's probably what I'm best known for.
Okay,
sorry, that was quite a long.
No, it was good. No, you are our guest, so you're here to introduce yourself. Absolutely, okay. That's fantastic. So, there's a recording of you singing a hymn. You said when you were 2.
Yes.
Oh, so there's some hope, then, Stephen, right? There's some hope.
Yeah,
you never.
Maybe I'll see why.
So you're slightly cutting up, I think, because of the internet, but we'll tolerate the lag. It happens to all live streams, so don't worry. If I haven't heard you, I'm just going to ask you just to repeat yourself if there's any internet issues. Okay, so let's get straight into the kind of conversation. I want you to imagine, for example, I come from a Greek background, and imagine we're on the island of Samos, and on the island of Samos, right next to the beach, there's a coffee shop, and there's usually old men there drinking Greek coffee, and they usually have discussions, and they're open and they're authentic, and they're hopefully committed to each other's well-being. But sometimes they can get a bit controversial. Sometimes they could basically get a bit loud, but then they hug and kiss at the end. So that's the kind of dynamic today. Just imagine it's a Greek coffee shop, and we've been around for a while. We're having this conversation. And just for the audience to know, me and Dr. Stephen, we had discussions at De Montfort University in Kingston, I believe, as well. And they were very fruitful discussions. In actual fact, one of those discussions was quite important for me in terms of to continue my kind of intellectual journey concerning science and religion. So in a way, I have to be thankful, because you're thankful for those experiences, because they only help you grow. So freedom of speech, this is like a hot potato. There's a lot of controversy at the moment, obviously with the Batley case. I don't know the specific details, but that hopefully has become a motivation to have such discourse. And also you had Charlie Hebdo, and you have other things concerning religion, and the freedom of speech issue always comes up. So what would be your summary? So then we could start having a conversation. What would be your summary on the issue of freedom of speech?
Okay. Well, look, before we do that, am I coming across okay at the moment?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, because I could go and turn on another router, which might improve the communication. It would take me like 30 seconds. Do you want me to
go for it. Go for it.
Do that? Just give me 30 seconds. I'll try.
No problem. So for those who are just coming on board, just to let you know that Dr. Stephen has gone to turn on another router in order to make the kind of online experience far more better for every single one of you.
Right, well, let's hope that improves the communication a little bit. So you want me to talk sort of generally about freedom of speech. So obviously I'm a fan. I mean, I think most of us are, really, broadly speaking. I think of myself as fairly liberal. What I am in particular, though, which I think is probably going to be most relevant here, is I'm a political secularist. So that means that I like the state to be neutral with respect to religious beliefs. So it neither promotes religion nor does it promote atheism. It should simply keep out of that particular debate. And it shouldn't privilege religious voices, but neither should it privilege atheists, critics of religion, say. A state in which you have a theocracy, say, is obviously not a politically secular state, because one religion is privileged and its voice has authority in a way that would be unacceptable to me as a political secularist. But similarly, I would disapprove of a kind of totalitarian, authoritarian atheist state. You know, Stalin's Soviet Republic, for example, clamping down on religious beliefs, stuffing socks into the mouths of religious people. I'm very much against that too. I think the state should be neutral. And I also think that the state should protect the freedom of religious and non-religious people to do what they want to do, so long as they're not causing other people harm, and in particular express their views. So I think religious people should be free to express their religious points of view everywhere, in every context. I would not support gagging religious people. But similarly, I think non-religious people should have their speech protected too, and they should be able to criticize religion, mock religion, even in much the same way as so I think that although I understand that people have strong feelings about religion, and I would never go out of my way to cause offense to a religious person just for the sake of it, and that would be an awful thing to do. I would insist on the right to criticize religion and even mock religion in much the same way as I would defend the right to criticize and mock non-religious beliefs, atheist beliefs, political beliefs, for example. I don't think that political beliefs that are non-religious deserve any kind of special respect or protection or privilege. I think it's perfectly okay to mock political leaders. You see cartoons published in newspapers which caricature religious people, political leaders and political beliefs. And because I think that's acceptable, and because I'm a political secularist, I think that the same is true of religious beliefs too. They shouldn't get any special protection. They shouldn't get any special privileges. They should be treated on par with other kinds of belief. So this view is not exclusively atheist. There are lots of religious people who are political secularists. And the reason that they're political secularists is often because they see that a politically secular society protects their freedom to express their religious beliefs, ensures that their opponents, be they religious opponents or non-religious opponents, that they will be kept at bay by the state. They will be protected. Their rights will be protected by a politically secular system. So, yeah, you find a lot of religious people are political secularists. I'm sure there are plenty of Muslims that are political secularists, for example, but of course not all. And in fact, there are Christians and Jews and so on who are less inclined towards political secularism. So this is an issue that cuts across the religious atheist divide. You find supporters and critics on both sides. So there you go. That's probably gives you a sense of where I'm going to be coming from when it comes to this particular issue.
Okay, good. My take on this is it's impossible to say that there's absolute freedom of speech. Now, I don't think that really applies in the UK context, but there are some American ideologues, if you like, they're very absolutist about freedom of speech, meaning no restriction whatsoever. And they usually cite the kind of slippery slope argument that if you have any restrictions, it's a slippery slope into tyranny. But obviously the door swings both ways philosophically, because if you don't have any restrictions at all, it could be anarchy, right? So as the academic David Van Mill talks about this, and therefore, and I'm citing David Van Mill here, he makes a very interesting point. He says, since there's no absolute freedom of speech, it is therefore restricted in some cases because of competing values. So the discussion we should be having, I think, is, well, what are these values? Because you've made an interesting point about protecting the rights of religious and non-religious people in terms of expression. And you've mentioned about mockery, and that is something that I would disagree with. I would basically say that is slightly problematic, because when we look at freedom of speech is not intrinsically valuable, it's instrumental. So for example, it's a means to some ends, such as truth, accountability, scientific progress. John Stuart Mill also talked about human flourishing and so on and so forth. So I don't think that there is nothing necessary about, for example, gratuitous insult, because there's a difference between gratuitous insult and just, coming across offensive. So if you intend to gratuitously insult, that doesn't necessarily lead to the objectives of freedom of speech. I would even argue, Dr. Stephen, I want your take on this. If we had a society where everyone mocked in a gratuitous way, wouldn't that be contrary to the very objectives of freedom of speech? Because people would be now afraid to articulate themselves and promote their version of the truth, if you like. And what would be very important in this context is it would undermine truth, which is an objective of freedom of speech, surely. And what's significant here is if we look at human nature, and what we mean by human nature is how humans are, not how we like them to be. Humans want dignity. So if a particular religious belief, for example, or even an ideological belief, even a secular ideological belief, for example, has formed the essence of someone's identity, and they relate to those ideas as part of the kind of purpose of life, surely in order to fulfill some of the objectives of freedom of speech, we need to at least not to have an intention to gratuitously insult. That would be my take on this issue, and then we could unpack further issues later. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. So personally, I don't favor just gratuitously insulting or offending people. But we need to separate out a few issues, maybe. So there's a legal issue. Should it be banned? Should it be illegal to mock certain religious beliefs, for example? Should we have a law of blasphemy? I don't know what you think about that. Would you favor that?
I would favor, in the law at the moment in the UK basically has already legal restrictions on offense, right? And they even discuss, for example, was it an intent to offend? Was it gratuitous? And so on and so forth. So British law and law in Europe and other places already stipulates these laws, not only on religious minorities, by the way, but also on non-religious minorities. For example, you have this with the LGBTQ and others, right? So from this perspective, everyone has their sacred cow, right? Everyone has, something sacred, even in a secular sense. And what's very important here is that what has been discussed in law is actually dignity. It's not necessarily contingent on a religious belief. It's about, are you dignifying the individual, right? And this is very important. So
because I was asking you about blasphemy, which is
I'm going to address that.
Well, so we need to separate out blasphemy, which is attacking, religious beliefs or images or whatever, and on the other hand, attacking particular communities, people, ridiculing them, suggesting that they are less than human or something like that. These are completely different things. So we want to be very careful that we don't muddle them up, because I'm certainly in favor of laws that prevent people from inciting hatred against minorities. But that's not a blasphemy law. A blasphemy law is a law that prevents you from blaspheming, from saying something, for example, that religious people think should be prohibited, and the state steps in and prohibits it, so that if you say it, or if you show the image, then you go to jail or you're prosecuted or whatever. Yeah. So so let's not get into the protecting community. I'm all in favor of laws that protect communities from being abused and smeared and hatred incited against them. But I'm asking you about whether there should be a blasphemy law, a law that protects religious beliefs and images or whatever.
Good question. I'll answer that just very quickly about there isn't a clear distinction between ideas and people in many cases, especially when it comes to people's beliefs that forms their identity. This is very crucial, right? And I'm going to answer the blasphemy thing. I'm not sidetracking, but it's very important to unpack that. For example, there was a recent study. It was a scientific study, and they came to the conclusion that study basically says that homosexuality, for example, or sexual preference is not dictated by directly dictated by genetics, right? That's a scientific study. And what they did is they adopted what I'm talking about today. They basically had a scientific communicator. They went to the LGBTQIA plus advocacy groups. They discussed with them. They said, we have this paper. Our conclusion is we've done this study that there is no direct kind of link between genetics and sexual preference. And basically, we want to be sensitive to this, and we want to communicate in a way in order for it to be conducive to what they consider to be a representation of reality, right? Because they believe this theory or this study is as closer to the actual state of affairs as possible. So even in cases like this, well, that idea, especially in the UK, if you were to say something like that, that could be seen as homophobic and therefore illegal. But in the case of the scientists here, what they did is they were sensitive to that, and they understood that there's not a very clear distinction sometimes between someone's identity and their beliefs, and sometimes how they relate to themselves, their state of being, and the ideas that they have. So I don't think it's as simple as that. But concerning the blasphemy law, it's very simple. The Islamic paradigm, we have some certain ontological commitments, right? We believe, not only as a faith, but we think we have good reasons to believe. I know you've engaged with many philosophers on this issue before, that God exists, he's worthy of worship, and there is a final prophet, the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace. And what does that say? That becomes a kind of basis for our meta-ethics and our ethical theory, like we're divine command theorists from that perspective. What the divine instructive says is that you cannot gratuitously insult and intend to insult God and all of his prophets. Not only that, God himself says you can't condemn or insult anyone else's idol. And the kind of exegesis behind this is going to be a secular idol. For example, I'm not going to go to America and start burning the American flag. So there is a kind of ethic here that is not only specific to God and his messengers, but any type of idol, even in a secular sense. I think that makes us far more consistent, right? Because the kind of, as we said, freedom of speech is restricted to values. From the Islamic values point of view, we say that you can't intend to offend anyone. You shouldn't, right? And we can unpack that later and how that's conducive to the objectives of freedom of speech. So the kind of blasphemy laws from that perspective, obviously, they're not applied properly. I know there's not transparency and due process in many countries, but that's a different political discussion. We're having an abstract discussion here. I would say is that if you think about it conceptually, whether you believe it or not is a different story, but conceptually, let's stand in the position, stand in the possibility that these things are true, then insulting God and his messengers is one of the greatest forms of gratuitous insult you can ever make, because they are the intellectual basis for your rights. Now, I know you disagree with that for sure, but I want you to stand in the possibility so you understand it, intellectually empathize. So it's not as simple as, and you remember this doesn't mean you can't have intellectual debate and dialogue, right? Because as you know, you've probably studied a bit of the Islamic history, medieval Baghdad, for example, when atheists were getting burnt in Europe, they were sitting at the intellectual table. We have this concept of the Dahriya, which are like the philosophical naturalists of the time. There was nuanced debate and discussion, but it was with an intellectual tone, and there was no intent to gratuitously insult. So that would be my answer from that perspective.
Well, so my question was, do you support blasphemy laws which make it illegal to mock or insult certain religious beliefs and figures? And I guess your answer is yes.
Yes, absolutely. Based on what I said, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. And I don't, I don't support that.
Sure, I get that.
So okay. So do you think that ideally then the teacher at the Batley Grammar School, then he should actually be prosecuted and perhaps sent to jail for doing what he did? He would support that. Well, a law that you would support the introduction of a law that would see his behavior criminalized. And
no, because I don't know the case properly. There's different conflicting scenarios. I haven't studied the case, so even to make a judgment, it would be ridiculous, right? Although I think if what is being said is true, he probably violated the teacher's code of conduct, because because my sister's a teacher, she's a senior manager, and she's not Muslim, just to put that in there, because you have to be sensitive when it comes to people's ideas and identity, because there's not a direct distinction, especially at that age. So you have to understand it from a perspective of, we're living in a time where Muslim minorities, especially in Europe, maybe not more so this country, maybe more so in France, right? But yes, in this country too, it's a denigrated minority to a certain degree. If you look at the kind of academic research on the media, you know, it's denigrated and downtrodden from that perspective. Now, in that context, if you show symbols of, you know, for example, the Prophet Muhammad, that is the basis for the identity and for the state of being and for their morals and so on and so forth. And if you have Islamophobic tropes, for example, even if it's in the context of blasphemy, what that can do, that can be damaging from an edification point of view, from a teacher's point of view. What I would say is there could have been so many other ways that you could have used examples in a teacher setting in order to make your point, but without basically, you know, creating the kind of hoo-ha that's been created. Notwithstanding, I need to put a context. I don't know the full case. Yeah, I don't know the situation. I don't know if it was with intent. I don't know what was going on. And to be honest, I try not to see the media anymore because, you know, and that's another thing about freedom of speech, right? We live in a post-truth culture. Freedom of speech, in this way, you're allowed to mock everybody. It's devalued politics. It's devalued truth itself. People don't believe in truth anymore. They don't believe.
Wait, hang on. Right. Let's not get carried away. Okay.
Yeah, go for it.
I mean, to allow. So you've said things that suggest that you think that allowing people to mock beliefs somehow means that. Well, you seem to think it was potentially a threat to free speech because people won't express their views anymore. They'll be afraid to express their views, so we won't get to the truth. This is simply not true. To allow mockery and a bit of ridicule and satire and so on does not stop those whose beliefs are being satirized from defending their beliefs and arguing for their beliefs, not at all. And in fact, sometimes a little bit of mockery actually opens up the possibility of us seeing something that we had missed. And so a famous example, a famous illustration, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is The Emperor's New Clothes, the Hans Christian Andersen story, where the king is duped by a couple of tailors who tell him that they can weave clothes that are so fine that anyone without the sufficient sensitivity won't be able to see them. And if you're wearing these clothes, you will appear naked. And so they make him an outfit, or so they say, and he can't see it. But rather than admit his lack of sensitivity and sophistication, he pretends to put the clothes on and parades around naked. And then he invites people in to admire his new outfit. And of course, no one wants to admit that they're not they're not sensitive enough to appreciate the outfit. So they're all admiring it too and telling him how great. He parades up and down the town in his outfit, completely naked, with everyone applauding the wondrous finery that he's wearing, until one small boy points and laughs and mocks him. And at that point, the spell is broken. All right, that's what it took. A little bit of mockery, a little bit of laughter, to get people to finally see that they'd been a bit silly, that they'd been duped. Sometimes a little bit of mockery is extremely useful, and it can get us to take a step back and just pack it in with all of the deference and the hand wringing and the forelock tugging, and just take a step back and think, oh, hang on a second, maybe I've got this wrong. And so some of the greatest little insights that have come from people when it comes to sort of politics and so on have been in the form of satires and parodies, and they've been really useful at opening people's eyes in a way that simply wouldn't be possible if you just came at the beliefs head on and just treated them as with the respect that they were demanding. So it seems to me that it's very often the people who demand respect. You must respect my beliefs. You must not mock them. Those people are usually the people whose beliefs most need mocking.
Okay.
They're the people, right, that most need a little bit of mockery, just to open people's eyes to the possibility that actually all of this respect and deference and something might actually be hiding something that's not true. So it seems to me that mockery has an important role to play. And it has an important role to play in politics. And if people were to try to prevent me from mocking my government and my political opponents, I would consider that outrageous. And most people would consider that completely unacceptable.
I think
now, I don't know what you think about that, but if that is unacceptable, then as a political secularist, I have to say the same about religious beliefs too.
I think it depends what you define as mockery. And what I meant here is obviously you can have an intellectual tone and come across in a way that is rhetorical and make your point. But is mockery and gratuitous insult necessary in order to achieve the objectives of, getting creating awakenings within people and getting people to see the light, kind of thing? No, it's not necessary. That's my point. So this is
if it's necessary, it's not gratuitous. If it's actually, if it's a useful tool, and often it is, then it's not gratuitous. So there's a point to it. There is often a point to satire and mockery and so on. But even if there isn't, it's not really for me, I feel, to judge. Maybe the person thinks that there is a point. I don't want to start shutting down debate and satire and parody and so on when it comes to the political sphere. I think that would be a very dangerous precedent if we were to say, no, you cannot make cartoons of political leaders and you cannot lampoon political ideas. That's a hallmark of a pretty authoritarian state. Now, if we're going to say that about political beliefs and political figures, then my view is we should say exactly the same thing about religious people and religious figures. I personally would disapprove of anyone gratuitously offending a Muslim. There would be, there's no point to it. But I would legally protect the right of people to mock religion, any religion, not just Islam. It seems to me that. So I guess, to sum up, I'm coming at this really from a point of view of consistency. I want to treat all beliefs with an equal amount of respect. I don't want to afford religious beliefs any special privileges. What's your view here? Do you think that even political beliefs and political figures should be prevented from being mocked and lampooned?
Yes. So I want to be very consistent. The Islamic ethical paradigm here is that you have to consider the dignity of all people. This is one of what you call the kind of higher intents of, Islamic ethics. Now, what's very important here is that's why when I mentioned about the blasphemy case, this applied to other religions, and also the protraction of that is when you refer to Islamic ethics, you can't basically insult the kind of secular idols as well. So you have to be as ethical as possible. So there's a consistency here. So I would say is,
but wait, because there's also a lack of consistency. There's a kind of consistency because you want to protect all of these beliefs equally, not just your own. But there's also this inconsistency that you want. So you have your religion, and it has its requirements as you understand it. I don't think all Muslims agree about this, but let's suppose that there was a consensus that you mustn't mock religion, be it Islam or any other religion, or indeed political figures and so on. I've forgotten where I'm going with this. That's I've lost my thread. I'm tired because
it happens to everybody. When you remember, just get back to me. Look,
you carry on, and it'll carry on, and it'll come to me in a second.
Yeah, sure. So with regards to this issue of mocking, again, you have to define what that means. And we also have to understand that the default kind of Islamic ethical position is that you have to consider the dignity of people, whether they're leaders or not, whether they're politicians, whether they're religious people, whether they're non-religious people. The kind of dignity is very important. So as a default position, the default position would be is you see and you relate to people through that kind of ethical lens. Now, what I said earlier about, I wasn't necessarily saying that, you can't have some kind of intellectual lampooning and with an intellectual tone kind of dismantle ideas. Of course not. What I'm saying is, imagine everyone was in a state of mockery. Everyone was basically mocking and insulting, and they were like, it was insult to the degree where there was like a gray area between insult and gratuitous insult and all of these things. That would, I said, in that context, that would prevent the objectives of freedom of speech, was like truth, accountability, and progress. And I think we've seen that in the contemporary times, Dr. Stephen. For example, you know, COVID deniers, the Trump era. And you remember, when we're talking about freedom of speech, we're assuming everyone has equal power. Not everyone has equal power with regards to like speaking what they have to, what they want to say and express themselves. So that's something that needs to be considered as well. We don't have power. And one thing I want to bring into light, and I'll let you continue, is we have to also understand, we can't see this from, and I know you might disagree with this, a liberal perspective. What I mean by that is, if you consider, as some philosophers do, liberalism to have a premise which is individualism, we can't see it from the perspective of individualism. I'll tell you why. Because studies have obviously shown in social psychology, cognitive science, and so on and so forth, and just common sense, right, is that the human being doesn't live in a vacuum. It's not in a desert island. There's this kind of interplay between the individual, society, and the individual. What we say actually really matters. And you know, when people say, oh, why are you guys so sensitive and all of this stuff? Well, in neuroscience is telling us now that the things that you say can change your kind of, your neurochemical patterns, can change your biology, right? So and that's why in the Islamic tradition, it takes very seriously what you say to others and how you say it. I know that's difficult for many because we've been brought up in a secular society and liberal society. We could say whatever we want and lampoon and mock and insult. But now I think it's time to start thinking about these things maybe a little bit more seriously and thinking, just like what David Van Mill said, freedom of speech is not absolute. It's restricted based on values. What are these values? This is important to discuss. And what's the basis for the values?
No, I agree that, freedom of speech is not unlimited. I mean, you don't really find anyone that thinks that, not even Mill famously, who defends free speech, but even he thinks that there are exceptions. Everyone thinks, any reasonable person thinks that there are some exceptions. If you go back, if you remember what I said at the beginning, my point was about consistency, that we shouldn't treat religious and non-religious beliefs differently. And it sounds to me like you kind of agree, actually. It's just that you want to restrict both. You want to prevent mockery on both sides of the equation, whether it's mockery of religious beliefs or whether it be mockery of political beliefs. So in a way, you're on board with my consistency requirement. It's just that you want to clamp down on what people are allowed to say and do when it comes to certain styles of criticism, mockery, and so on. Here's the point I was going to make when I had my senior moment and lost my thread. Here's my point. You're saying that you're being fair and even-handed because you want to protect all beliefs, religious, this religion, that religion, this political belief, that political. You want to treat them all equally and protect them all. But there's a sense in which you're not being even-handed, which we're kind of skating over, and it's this. It's that your religion trumps everything else, including, I don't share your religious beliefs. Most people in this country don't share your religious beliefs, and yet you think that we should have imposed on us legally constraints on what we're able to say and do, despite the fact that we don't sign up to your religion. That's an extremely heavy-handed and authoritarian attitude, it seems to me. Most religions don't do that. Most religions don't say, okay, most people in this country, they don't sign up to our religion, but nevertheless we insist and we demand that your laws restrict everyone's behavior in accordance with our religion, whatever it may happen to be. That's an extremely demanding, extremely authoritarian attitude for a religious person to take, and most religious people are not like that. You are, and that's what I find. That's what I find most worrying about your attitude.
Well, I don't know if I've articulated it that way. I don't think I've said that you have to impose, as a Muslim minority, the Islamic beliefs on this issue. I wasn't really saying.
But you're saying that you want this principle of not mocking, right? You want it legally imposed. You said, yeah, I'm signing up to blasphemy. I want a blasphemy law. I want laws that prevent people from mocking Islam or Christianity or political leaders and political. I want all of that imposed in this country.
But
I don't.
Yeah.
Now, I don't. I really don't want that, and I can't. And obviously, you're not going to convince me that this is a good idea by appealing to your religion, because I don't sign up to it.
No,
and also, I don't feel. I mean, I don't feel that I should go to other places and insist that they. You know, I would make a case for it, but I don't feel that I have some special authority by virtue of me being who I am or my identity or whatever it may, to go around telling other people how they need to run their regimes. If you as a Muslim don't want to see images of the Prophet Muhammad displayed and you're upset by that, I fully understand that, and I go ahead, don't do it. And I certainly am not going to go out of my way to gratuitously offend you by displaying such images. But by what right can you insist that non-believers, people of other faiths or no faith, that they must obey your prohibitions?
Well, I didn't say they should do that at all. What I'm saying is that I was taking a case in order for secular law to be consistent, because it's already in the law. That's all I was saying. The law talks about offense. The law talks about all of these things, even when it doesn't offend to the degree that is gratuitous. So all I'm saying is, my position was an ethical position, and yes, my ethics happen to come from the divine command. But that's not me saying everyone has to follow my way. I'm just saying this is a more consistent way of looking at the world. Why? Because you don't end up in these situations. Because secularism, from that context, has kind of failed. Because in a way, what you're saying, Muslims can't impose their ideas on the masses. Well, isn't it the case that secularism and liberalism imposes itself on the masses? Look at its kind of perspective on LGBTQ, right? You know, people can't articulate a nuanced intellectual case about something without being accused of being homophobic or whatever the case may be, even though we're committed to the well-being of all human beings, right? We want goodness and guidance for everybody. One would argue, and that's why you have to see it from the other perspective, just wear my shoes or wear another person's shoes and see, well, the door swings both ways on this issue. I could say, well, isn't secularism being authoritative? Isn't liberalism being authoritative from that perspective? It's failed minorities. It's claimed to be able to bring everyone together. But when it comes to these issues, it can't even dignify minorities, right? From that perspective. What I'm saying is the Islamic ethic dignifies everybody, whereas the secular ethic, well, it has, it's in a bit of a sticky wicket.
I'm not sure I've followed all of that. So I said I'm a political secularist. So I think that we should treat religious and non-religious beliefs equally, and we should defend people's freedoms to express their religious beliefs or anti-religious beliefs, or whatever it may happen to be, up to certain limits, because everyone thinks that there are certain limits on free speech. So inciting hatred against a minority community, for example, is obviously completely unacceptable. And if that's what's going on, be it the gay community or black community or whatever it might happen to be, I'm fully on board with protecting people from that kind of hate speech. That's in place. But this is quite different from laws which are designed to prevent religious, Margaret Thatcher or the Prophet Muhammad or whatever it might happen to be, prevent them from being mocked and preventing ideas and beliefs from being mocked. So we constantly want to separate out these things. I'm all for protecting the Muslim community that certainly has been abused and vilified and smeared in this country, in very unfairly. I know that that's true. I'm not disputing that for a minute, but I at the same time, and I would want them to have legal protections, but at the same time, because I'm a political secularist, I'm unhappy, to say the least. I'm unhappy about introducing any kind of legislation which would prevent me from mocking anyone's religious belief, in much the same way as I would be very unhappy about legislation which would prevent me from mocking political beliefs. And I've explained why. And I've explained why it seems to me that mockery and ridicule and lampooning are important and valuable tools because of the the emperor's new clothes kind of. And other cases too. I mean, there's artistic freedom. So sometimes artists like to push the boundaries, and sometimes they do that in slightly distasteful ways. There was a famous example, I think, of there was somebody created a crucifix with Christ on, and immersed it in their own urine, and then took a picture of it and called it Piss Christ back in 1987, I think it was. Obviously, that was was pretty offensive to many Christians, but in the same way, whenever David Cameron was portrayed by the cartoonist Steve Bell, he had a massive condom pulled over the top of his head. This used to appear in the pages of The Guardian every day. There is a point to allowing that kind of mockery and satire. There's an artistic reason for allowing it. It allows us to get a glimpse of the truth when perhaps we've been overly duped by too much reverence and forelock doffing and so on. I don't want that restricted. And I think you'll have a very hard time persuading anyone in this country that kind of freedom of speech should be restricted, and it would certainly be massively abused by people in power if you were to introduce it. Just look at what this government is doing right now in terms of restricting our ability to protest. If you even risk annoying somebody now, you can be arrested and locked up. Your protest. You can be sure that this government, indeed most governments, given the opportunity, will seize any tool at their disposal to shut down opposition to what they believe. And they will certainly use any kind of legislation which says you're not allowed to mock or satirize political and religious beliefs. They will certainly use that to shut down opposition to their beliefs.
We have to make a distinction between how the government will misuse laws and the kind of ideal application of laws. Just because someone's going to misuse laws, it doesn't mean the laws are wrong. I mean, in many parts of the Islamic world, there's so-called Islamic laws, but they're misapplied, misused. That doesn't necessarily mean that the laws are wrong. It definitely means that there's something wrong with those who are implementing them.
If a law is very easily misused, then that's a very good reason for not introducing it.
Well, when it comes to the issue of speech, for example, again, we have to define what mocking is. So my discussion was, if there is an intent to gratuitously insult someone, if there is
gratuitously means there's no point to it. But now, how are you going to establish that? You need to look into someone's mind and establish. You can't establish intent. And
this happens. Sorry, there's a lag. This happens in law anyway. They discuss intent and intent to offense anyway in British law. So, if these legal jurists can do it, I'm sure, it's not that difficult. So I think that's a little bit of a red herring. What I would say is the dignity of people are very important. This is a kind of ethical framework. The dignity of people are very important. The dignity of someone is very important. And the examples that you've given concerning, mockery and lampooning, especially the one concerning the emperor, that's like a fictional story. When we apply in the real world, remember, human nature, humans as they are, not as we want them to be, it gets far more fuzzy. And the reason I said earlier, if we always have this kind of narrative of mocking each other in ways that affect our dignity, it will be contrary to the objectives of freedom of speech. Because I think what you're trying to do, Stephen, which, Doctor, is somehow you're trying to show that mockery and lampooning in some cases is like an inherent right or has some kind of intrinsic value. And I think that's problematic in the discourse, especially from a secular perspective, because you couldn't ground it in natural rights, because that's almost nonsense on stilts, as Jeremy Bentham said. Where's the social utility behind that? I don't know if people are going to, if that is necessarily so. What about eudaimonic approach to grounding these kind of values? Happiness. Well, I don't think people are happy when they're always mocked, right? And especially when there's a misuse of power. And remember what you said about people, if the law can be misused. Well, mockery is also misused a lot. It happened in Nazi Germany in the beginning, right? It's happening in China with the Uyghurs, right? So
yeah, but no. But again, we're slipping backwards and forwards between mocking communities and inciting hatred against communities on the one hand, and mocking political and religious leaders and belief systems on the other. These are not the same thing, and you're constantly having, in order to make your case, you're constantly having to mush them together. And although they do bleed into each other a little bit, it's a grey area. Okay, that doesn't mean that we can't separate out black and white. There's grey. That doesn't mean that black and white don't exist. These are different things. Let's not muddle them up. Let's keep them separate. Okay, so I'm all in favour of legislation which protects minorities from being abused and vilified and hate speech against them and so on. Of course, I am in favour of that, but I'm not in favour of legislation which would say you're not allowed to mock your political leaders. I'm not in favour of that. And your argument seems to be that, well, but what if everyone did that all the time? I mean, what if everyone mocked everyone all the time? That would be really bad, wouldn't it? Well, yeah, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen. I mean, if I'm allowed to eat cheesecake.
Wait. It does happen.
There's no law that says I can't eat cheesecake. But if I ate cheesecake all the time and we all ate nothing but cheese, that would be terrible. So therefore, there should be a law against eating cheesecake. No. The fact that if everyone mocked everyone all the time, that would be really bad. Therefore, there must be no mockery. That's a terrible argument. Okay, don't use that one. And there is a point to allowing mockery. The Emperor's New Clothes case gives one nice illustration of how actually it's very good at breaking the spell and allowing people to get an insight that otherwise would not be easily available to them. A little bit of humor, a little bit of mockery. We know that can often be very, very effective. And one of the nicest examples was it Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal? I think it is. I think it was. He has this essay called A Modest Proposal, and you're reading it, and it all sounds terribly reasonable, but then you realise that what he's actually proposing is that we kill and eat the children of the poor. It's a joke. It's horrible and offensive in a way, and yet the logic of it is exactly the logic that you find in many other political debates. And so it provides a kind of insight. It allows you to see the absurdity of certain kinds of argument and certain kinds of position. That kind of mockery does that in a way that almost nothing else can. And so you should not prohibit it. And of course, the people that benefit most from constraints on people being mocked and being laughed at are the people who are using their reverence and respect and so on, like a monarch, using that to effectively control opinion. People who rely a lot, rather than giving arguments and so on, but simply rely on their prestige and their honor, and that kind of person is often the very person that you should be mocking.
Yeah, but listen,
people really deserve it. So I do not want mockery banned.
Dr. Stephen, again, it depends what you mean by mockery. I'm linking this to the dignity of others, okay? Because mockery is a subjective term. Look at France at the moment, what's happening. I don't know if you know the political situation, right, in France. Very aggressive secularism, right? They are mocking Muslims left, right, and center. You said it doesn't exist. It actually exists in France. And it exists in France to the degree that you have draconian laws in France that are preventing humanitarian Muslim charities from doing their work. They're also closing down mosques. Just do the research yourself.
That's not closing down mosques. Closing down mosques is not political secularism.
But let's not move away from the point. The point is, it started with a misuse of power. You said if these laws are in place, it could be misused by those in power. But the door swings the other way. If constant mockery, and what I mean by this is removing the dignity of others, is constantly happening, and it's happening with religious symbols. And you have to understand, Stephen, not everyone's a secularist and a philosophical naturalist. We love God and the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace. It becomes a part of our identity more than my own skin color. So when I see skin color being protected, which of course it shouldn't be, we should never be racist for sure. My love for God and the Prophet Muhammad, upon be peace, is an essential attribute of mine, right? It's become that. It's become the way I relate.
I understand that. Yeah.
So, so good. So what you need to realize here is this mockery as well, and that's when there needs to be this discussion about values. It's so important because freedom of speech is not absolutely, it's restricted based on values, competing values. We see what's happening in France. The symbols are being mocked, and at the same time, we see society attributing that mockery. And what I mean by mockery is removing the dignity of a collective, and that is affecting law. It's affecting the way Muslims are being treated. And this didn't just happen to Muslims; it happened in Nazi Germany. So we have someone in our institute called Dr. Uthman Latif. He did a postdoctoral research in dehumanization, otherization. He wrote a book called On Being Human. He's been published by Springer and Bill. He's an established academic. When you look at genocide, when you look at otherization, othering and dehumanization, it's not as simple as, oh, we could mock someone's beliefs and we could treat people really nicely. Societies just don't work that way. We need to have a more nuanced, human-centric discussion about this issue. Yes, I agree with you. We must be intellectually rigorous concerning ideas. Me and you had a debate before on God's existence, problem of evil. You gave your really interesting argument about the kind of good, bad God and stuff like that. You know, I didn't say to you, how dare you, you're mocking my beliefs. I didn't respond that way because it was an intellectual tone. You lampooned me as well, and you mocked me, but with I'm so sorry. So you did it with an intellectual tone, and you did it with, hopefully, you were committed to my well-being, right? And my interaction with you on that, especially when I talked about the Quran and science, helped me develop my ideas further, from what I remember. So it was a good thing. However, it's not as simple as what you're saying as well, and the whole power thing. The door could swing the other way too, and it's happening in France. If you look at dehumanization studies, it's not as simple as there's a distinction between someone's beliefs and someone's and basically the person themselves. And so my point here is, I see where you're coming from, because Europe has had a very interesting history concerning freedom of speech. You know, you had the Catholic Church at that time. They were using the coercive arm of the state to prevent any kind of intellectual discourse and thinking that was incongruous, which is with its teachings. And then, you know, you had the Reformation, you had trade issues and so on and so forth, and you had a very bloody history, right? But that Eurocentric experience cannot now be protracted to the whole of the world, because, with all due respect, I'm not saying Islamic history has all been rosy. You know, whoever over glorifies their history, that's a sign of a defeated mind, in my view. But it didn't have the same issues. There wasn't that huge problem between thinking, progress, truth, accountability, and power structures to that degree, right? So that's why you have to see it from a different ethical paradigm. And if you see it from that perspective, I think under the Islamic ethical framework, it's more consistent, and it's more virtue ethics. It's more consistent as well, and it's more, what I would say, human centric from that point of view, because it's about the dignity of others. Yes, you could intellectually mock with an intellectual tone, but there are areas that we have to discuss, because we don't live on a desert island. We are connected to other human beings, and it can create things just like what happened in Nazi Germany, unfortunately. And this is part of the academic studies. Yeah,
good. Well, I mean, there's a lot going on in what you're saying there. So, so to tease out a couple of things. So, you're saying that Muslims are being vilified and misrepresented and smeared, and I think that's true. And I want to protect them from that as much as we can. As a community, I don't want to see hatred whipped up in that kind of way. So, but we do have legislation in place to protect them. You know, maybe there should be more. I don't know, but that I'm all in favour of. Now, you say that in other countries, I'm not following the situation in France, but you said things like well, what did you say? This place was shut down, I think. You said
what's happening, you have to see it as a kind of a holistic approach to what's happening in society. So we don't certain things away from what is really going on. So what's really happening is there's this kind of excessive extremist secular agenda going on, to the degree that Islamic and Muslim symbols are being denigrated to the degree that people use now to actually affect the dignity of Muslims, right? The way they're treated in X, Y, and Z. It's spoken in parliament. It's also facilitating a kind of environment where now they're making laws.
Give me an example of what you're talking about. So in France, give me an example of the use of a symbol, the denigration of a symbol, and how that's impacting on the Muslim community. Can you do that?
Well, very simple. What happened in Charlie Hebdo, and the depictions of the cartoons with Islamophobic tropes that, you know, Muslims about terrorism and so on and so forth. That if that continues, right, every drop raises the ocean. That creates a kind of social norm. And you know what's interesting about the social norm, Dr. Stephen, right? So in social psychology, you have the development of the social norm is based on your need to feel certain and your need to belong. These are fundamental human things. So if I don't have my certainty from my subgroup, I'm going to go to the dominant group. For example, if I'm unsure about these Muslims, I'm going to find out what the dominant group is saying about these Muslims. Yeah. So if these, you know, the secular elite and the politicians and the media are saying always bad things about them and the ideas are bad and they can't distinguish between the two, and that's how the narrative is being played out, then, you know, there's something wrong about these Muslims, right? And also we have a need to belong, right? And that need to belong, if we can't belong from our kind of subgroup, we're going to try and get that belonging from the dominant group. This develops the social norm and social dynamics. That says a lot, and there's much more to say about society from that perspective in social psychology. But that's why it's not as simple as the kind of abstracting the discourse by saying, "Oh, allow him to mock." Don't get me wrong. I want intellectual dialogue, rigorous dialogue, like we're having today, which is fantastic.
You want to prohibit all mockery right across the board, including in the political sphere.
I want to stop the removing the dignity of people. Again, it depends what you mean by mockery. Some people think that mockery is saying that you don't believe in a God.
Would you prevent? Well, to give you an example, so you would prevent the artwork Piss Christ from being shown, and would you clamp down on cartoons that represent David Cameron with a big condom over his head, or Margaret Thatcher as an evil witch? Would you prevent that kind of imagery?
I mean, specific examples I would have to think about, but the general ethical perspective. Remember, there's a difference between ethics and applied ethics, right? So it would be intellectually shallow for me to respond immediately as if I've assessed the whole situation, right? I have epistemic.
Yeah, but I'm giving you concrete examples.
Yeah, I mean, if it affects the dignity of someone, and if it could be done in
it's certainly affecting David Cameron's dignity to have him represented with a massive condom.
Yeah, I wouldn't.
I imagine his mother is very upset about that. So, are we going to ban that?
I wouldn't recommend anyone putting pictures up of anyone, whether it's a
no. I'm not asking you that. I'm asking
you.
Yeah,
no, that should be any diminishing of the dignity of a human being should
you would ban it.
Prohibited.
You would ban those cartoons.
Why? Because it's bigger than just saying you would ban it. Okay. I'm not saying you can't intellectualize and you can't refute David Cameron and his policies. I'm not saying.
No, I know you're not saying that, but you are saying you would ban that kind of political imagery.
You know why? Because the utility here
I find that quite extraordinary, to be honest. But anyway, look, let me just. Can I just say something?
By the way, I'm not conservative, by the way.
No, I wasn't suggesting that you were. So obviously I'm not keen on banning any such imagery. It does seem to be hugely heavy-handed, unnecessary, a restriction on free speech, invaluable free speech, which for reasons I've spelt out, and it will clearly be abused. So I'm not persuaded by that, but I do understand that Muslims feel under attack, and that because they are, frankly. I mean, there's an awful lot of anti-Muslim propaganda in the press, and you can be sure that some people will kind of use Hebdo type imagery, say, or whatever it may happen to be, in order to sort of smear Muslims as a community. You know, they're all terrorists or whatever, something awful like that. I mean, and I don't approve of that, clearly. And possibly there was an element of that in the Hebdo, and if there was, then I'm not happy about that at all. I certainly don't defend it. But on the other hand, the fact that one of the arguments you're making for kind of this really severe clamping down on any kind of mockery, be it religious or politicians or whatever, is that, well, the case that you're making is that very often these beliefs are tied up with people's sense of identity. So that if you attack the belief or the symbol, you're attacking something that is kind of constitutive of who they are as a person, and so it is much more personal for them. And I can understand that, but I'm not. I mean, to think of some other illustrations, for example, there are political beliefs for which people are prepared to die. I mean, there are political beliefs for which I am prepared to die. And there are political beliefs. So there are political beliefs that people feel very, very strongly about, are very powerfully committed to, and their sense of identity is bound up with them very often, because politics and nationalism are often fused together. So you find that, Brexit, an incredibly emotional issue for many people, and it goes to their sense of who they are and what it means to be a British person. Okay, and yet I am completely relaxed about taking the piss out of those people. Yeah. Whether I agree with them or not, I have no objection to people lampooning them with all of their flag waving and their xenophobia, and be my guest. But your position, it seems to me,
dignify everybody,
would require that any such lampooning of that kind of xenophobic, nationalistic bullshit that we're seeing, because it's bound up with people's sense of who they are and their own sense of worth and identity. No, we can't allow that. Well, again, that just seems to me ludicrously heavy-handed and restrictive, and I wouldn't want to see laws like that introduced.
Well, the issue here is, remember, you're using the word mockery and clamping down a lot, yeah, and it's making me sound authoritarian.
I think you are, though. See, that's the thing. I actually think you are quite authoritarian. I know you don't think you are, but you're actually.
Because I've given you examples that even with your position, it can be abused, and it has been abused, and it has caused the suffering of thousands of people. So I would argue, well, you not having an ethical dimension to your legal theory is authoritarian, and it's damaging people, and it's actually it's actually locking people up for no reason. And so the door can swing both ways on this issue. You have to be able to stand in the possibility that allowing, and forget the word mockery, allowing the diminishing of the dignity of human beings in a collective, that can lead to authoritarian harm as well. So it's not necessarily the case just because I said that everyone has to be aware of people's dignity. And the law can have a stipulation such as we take each case on its own merit. There's actually more nuances. So it's not as if it's slightly straw manning me here, making me think, take Jeremy Corbyn as example. I think you're a bit of a Corbynite. I've been following you on Twitter, right? So Jeremy Corbyn was mocked to hell, right? To the point that it went against the objectives of freedom of speech, because many would argue it didn't represent his ideology, it didn't represent his policies, and it didn't represent the claims that he was making or what kind of society that he wanted. But the mockery was to the degree, right? The mockery was to the degree. Forget even the word mockery, because we haven't even defined it yet. The removing of his dignity was to the degree they actually prevented people from understanding the truth about Jeremy Corbyn, and therefore it is counterproductive and it's self-defeating. And that's why, as a philosopher, you know this better than I do, you are assuming there's some kind of intrinsic value behind mockery. it's an
Well, I
instrument.
made a case for it. I did give you an argument and an illustration, so it's not like I haven't provided.
Yeah, but your case wasn't applied in the real world. It was about some emperor, in some fictional story. But when you talk about human realities, it is far more nuanced.
Yeah, we could provide plenty of real examples. But anyway, look,
the Jeremy Corbyn.
So Jeremy Corbyn. So yeah. So as you point out, I am a bit of a fan of his politics, and many people on the right, on the left, and certainly even on the right. I mean, people like Peter O'Born, who's a used to be a Telegraph journalist. I mean, he has written scathingly about the way that Jeremy Corbyn was misrepresented and smeared and so on in the media. Obviously, I'm not very happy about the fact that he was misrepresented and smeared, but that's not the same as mockery.
Yes, I agree.
I have no problem with people mocking Jeremy Corbyn, drawing caricatures of Jeremy Corbyn in which he's made to look very unattractive. Be my guest. I don't care about any of that. People can do that. Mockery is completely fine, but that's not what happened. What happened was that accusations were made that he was a terrorist sympathizer, various other things. He was deeply anti-Semitic. There's no good evidence to support any of these claims. None of them were really true, and yet the mainstream media largely gave a free pass to people who endlessly repeated these smears over and over on front pages of newspapers, on BBC News even, more or less without challenge. And that I have a big problem with, but that's got nothing whatsoever to do with mockery. No, he wasn't treated with dignity and respect. A lot of the people who, I don't think everyone does deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. I mean, some people are just pretty awful. I don't think Hitler deserves to be treated. To pick the classic cliched example, some people are really awful, and we don't have to respect them, and we can go, no, this is a terrible person. And it's clear that some people genuinely and sincerely believe that Jeremy Corbyn really was a terrible person, and I have no problem with them saying that and expressing that opinion. Let them do that. It's just that it wasn't true, and it was never properly challenged by the mainstream media in this country. And as a result, we probably, we might well have had, I think, a Labour government now, had it not been for that campaign against him that was going on. Now,
but listen, Doctor,
but you're not going to deal with that.
No, you need to define mockery, because there's like two types of mockery we're talking about here. One is about mocking an argument and actions, right? By showing it's, reductio ad absurdo. Your actions are your arguments are they reduce things to absurdity, or the difference between mocking people and figures, basically insulting, right? So insulting in some cases doesn't serve any purpose from that perspective. So that's why I was really clear about dignity, because you mentioned it, and again with Corbyn, people attacking the dignity of Corbyn, and to be honest, calling him a terrorist is actually attacking his dignity as well.
Of course,
that affected the objectives of freedom of speech. Now, go on. But
I have no problem with people accusing Jeremy Corbyn of being a terrorist sympathizer. I mean, if people want to do that in the press, let them go ahead. I don't want to stop that exchange of ideas. What I have a problem with is the fact that
it was power.
Such claims were made and were never adequately challenged, not even by people in the BBC. Now that
Dr. Stephen, you've proven my point.
Oh dear.
The powers that be, people who had the power on the platform, misused it and misused mockery. They became authoritarian. Mockery, and what I mean by mockery, as I discussed it, was the dignity. They diminished the dignity of Jeremy Corbyn, and they used that ability to do so, and they used their power to do so. So when you said I was authoritarian, well, the door also swings the other way, that they were authoritarian by misusing the power, by lying about someone.
No, they're not authoritarians. They just are very powerful.
Yes, but that's what authoritarian is. You're using your power, isn't it?
No, they are very. I mean, these are clearly very powerful people.
Yeah, exactly.
The newspapers are owned by a tiny group of billionaires.
Absolutely. So here's my point.
Hmm.
Let's bring it back to freedom of speech and the objectives of freedom of speech: truth, human flourishing, accountability, scientific progress, etc.
Yeah.
What this discussion has brought to light is when you want to affect the dignity of other people and so-called use your freedom to insult to the degree where you affect someone's dignity that actually creates, and you have the power to do so, and it becomes like a big narrative, and that goes against the truth about someone, then that is actually self-defeating. It's going against the very objectives of freedom of speech. So there's only a few ways we could get out of this sticky wicket, I think. One way is by saying that freedom of speech has an intrinsic value, it's not instrumental, which I don't think anyone believes if they're a secularist, unless you believe in natural rights, which is very hard to defend. Or you would have to say freedom of speech is not intrinsically valuable, but mockery in this context, which is to diminish the dignity of other people, that has intrinsic value, which would be very difficult to philosophically justify. So I know, so yeah, you need to.
I'm confused now.
Okay, let me break that down. Try and make it simple. Yeah. So the Jeremy Corbyn case, and I use Jeremy Corbyn because I know you're a fan of him, right? Because I think it would just make more sense because you're more connected to it. So we have an environment where you can affect the dignity of other people. Whether you want to call that mocking or not is neither here or there, because my issue wasn't about mocking per se, it was about the dignity, and I mentioned that many times. So you could affect the dignity of many people. The power structures are not equal. So you have a powerful elite or powerful platforms that are using this so-called freedom to affect the dignity of a particular person. It creates a narrative, and that narrative creates a kind of social norm, if you like, or some kind of collective agreement to a certain degree that this person is a terrorist, is anti-Semitic, is so on and so forth. So what that has done, it has gone against the objectives of freedom of speech, which I don't think anyone would deny, which is truth, because it's not saying something truthful about a political leader or his ideologies and his perspectives. So what I'm saying here is this so-called freedom to continuously mock to the degree, and again, mocking here means diminishing the dignity of people, it can lead to a self-defeating situation where you actually don't have you don't have the objectives of freedom of speech fulfilled in the first place.
If you mean that the freedom to represent people as being bad people when perhaps they're not, can, in a situation where one side has the megaphone and can do all of the speaking and the other side lacks it, that's a bad situation, clearly. But my solution to that would be to give both sides a megaphone, or change the power structure so that the public opinion isn't shaped to a very large extent by 2 or 3 individual billionaires whose fortunes happen to be offshore. That would be the solution. The solution is not to prevent anyone saying stuff about other people that puts them in a bad light, because some people deserve to be put in a bad light. I mean, I happen not to think that's not true of Jeremy Corbyn, but still, I would want people to be able to say it about Jeremy Corbyn. But I would also want there to be some pushback, so people will defend him and point to the facts and correct the false narrative and so on. The problem was that none of that happened. Okay, because of the it seems to me the unfair power structure. So it's the power structure that's the problem. And if you were to introduce your favoured restrictions on what people are allowed to say in a situation where you have that very unbalanced power structure, it's obvious, isn't it, what's going to happen? The powerful people will use the restrictions that you want in place to shut down criticism of them, to start stuffing books in mouth. It's going to become an even more dangerous situation than we have. So the solution is to deal with the huge imbalance that exists in the way that public opinion is being formed, So we have Muslims, we have immigrants, we have benefit scroungers, we have, black people. We have them on the front pages of certain newspapers day after day after day, week after week, year after year, drip, 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 drip into the British psyche. This endless repetition of the perception of these people, anecdotes about these people as being bad, and also about the left. The left is just yet another group that's endlessly, constantly being represented in that way. That is disgusting and extremely dangerous.
Yes.
I have no problem with that, saying that. I'm not defending it, okay? But I don't think the solution to that is to have some kind of law introduced where you're not even allowed to say that some people are bad people.
We're not saying that. Let's be very careful.
But you say you are not allowed to denigrate.
You cannot diminish the dignity of other people. And what's easier, Doctor? What's easier? So we've got somewhere now, right? We're both in a corner, right? What's easier, giving everyone the same equal megaphone, or getting a society to basically articulate in themselves that doesn't remove or diminish the dignity of others? I think your case is a non-existent utopia. Right? It just doesn't exist. It's never existed, right? But I think
there are places where actually, there are places in Europe where the press is far more even-handed. In the Scandinavian countries, for example,
where they ban threats, right? Yeah.
So there are things you can do to prevent the excesses that we've seen in this country. I do not want to. We've moved from mockery through to demeaning people, saying things that are demeaning about people. Well, any kind of criticism of anyone is potentially demeaning about them. You're saying something negative about them. And once you introduce, mockery was bad enough, but now you've really opened the envelope up to demeaning is now no longer about individuals. And at that point, this is extremely scary stuff, so far as I'm concerned. It would certainly be abused by those in power.
That's only if you assume those who are in power do not have the adequate, kind of ethical and even maybe ontological commitments in order for them to believe that they're accountable and for them to basically treat people with dignity. I understand.
I'm putting my money on that.
I'm
putting my money on the fact that they won't.
You're seeing it from a very kind of naturalistic secular paradigm, because there have been other traditions in the past, people who have been in power, that actually wanted people to take into account. For example, in the Islamic tradition, the rulers, not all of them, of course, but the rulers in history, not today, they were begging for people to take them to account. For example, a companion of the Prophet Muhammad, upon him be peace, Umar ibn al-Khattab, he basically was so happy that when he said to his people, if I deviate from our ethics, what are you going to do? They said, we're going to straighten you, basically, right? He was so happy by that. We have an ethical system and a dimension. You have to stand in the possibility that you're coming from a perspective where, this is the nature of kind of, I don't know, secular politics. Politicians are not ideal people, generally speaking. And, when you try and get someone who is, you believe is decent, like Jeremy Corbyn, he's painted as someone evil. And people who have power, they get corrupted. Maybe there's something wrong with the secular model that is not good enough to basically ensure that we have good ethical role models as leaders. I don't know. That's another thing to unpack. But let me just bring this back down to freedom of speech, because remember, it's about freedom of speech. Forget the mockery, because you didn't define mockery. My issue here was not demeaning people, but removing the dignity of people, diminishing the dignity of people, which was a different kettle of fish. So, and case in point was Jeremy Corbyn, because it was created to the degree that it went against the objectives of freedom of speech, which was truth. So my thing is this. Let's end on maybe more of an ontological, meta-ethical discussion, since you're a greater philosopher than me. I'm still researching, but
to be honest, I'm no political philosopher, as anyone that knows anything about political philosophy will probably have managed to figure out. I just have I've written about humanism and political secularism a little bit, but don't take me as any sort of authority. I'm not really.
Yeah. So would you agree that freedom of speech, obviously we said we agreed that it's not absolute, it has to be kind of tailored to other competing values, as academic David Van Mill said, which is something that it's not controversial. Would you agree now that maybe a discussion should be had in what kind of these values, how do we ground these values? So for example, let me articulate something to you in about 2 minutes and let me get your take on it. Mm-hmm. So to ground values, because you have to talk about values now, because that's the thing that's restricting speech, right? So to ground values, you either have natural rights. So according to kind of, philosophical naturalism or secular paradigm, does it make sense? Can we ground these values in nature? There's a massive debate, as you know, in meta-ethics on this issue, but let me just summarize it with Jeremy Bentham. It's nonsense on stilts. Okay, the other way to go is maybe it's social utility. It increases the kind of well-being to a degree of the collective, and it removes the kind of harms. I would argue when it comes to freedom to insult, does it actually increase the well-being collectively of society? There is an argument to be had that types of insults, like gratuitous insults, and removing the dignity of human beings, diminishing the dignity of human beings, is not something that society wants. Then someone say, fine, okay, social utility doesn't work. We can't ground our values that way. What about eudaimonia, eudaimonic, kind of the happiness of society, the happiness of individuals? Now, well, human nature, remember, human nature is people as they are, not as we want them to be. Humans are not happy when their dignity is being affected. Look at the Meghan Markle case. That is case in point. The media were free to say what they want, and it affected her to the degree that she wanted to commit suicide. Are we saying that should be allowed to that degree? Like, forget law for one moment. Let's talk ethics. We live in a very troubling society where the media can say whatever they want to the degree that it would make people want to kill themselves. With all due respect, this is something that is unacceptable in any parallel universe, and even in this universe. Anyway, the point here is we can't really ground our values in natural rights, social utility, and eudaimonia from the point of view of justifying the denigration of someone's dignity, the diminishing of someone's dignity, and basically saying that we have this kind of right to gratuitously insult and to diminish the dignity of others. That can't be grounded in natural rights, social utility, or even a eudaimonic approach. Yeah. So what the Islamic situation says, as you know, the divine command theory, which we can unpack maybe another session, because I've really enjoyed our session today, by the way. Thank you.
Do all Muslims go for the divine command theory? I bet they don't, do they?
Okay, so that's a very good question. Thank you. So
I don't know.
Okay, so in the Islamic tradition, there's three main schools of creed.
Yeah.
So you have what you call the Ash'arites, you have the Maturidis, and you have the Athris. So the Ash'arites are divine command theorists, but from the point of view, they go with one of the horns of the dilemma. They said it's good because God commanded it. So one would argue that seems to be quite arbitrary, because it means that God could command that anyone who's got the name Dr. Stephen Law should be shot. God forbid, yeah? So so that's one thing. The other one, the Maturidis have the same view from the perspective of that they believe that it is about God's commands, but they believe that the human rationality can also coincide with understanding some of God's commands, but it's still based on God's arbitrary commands. The Athris have a different position, which is maybe closer to what the modern Christian philosophers are saying, which is, yes, it is divine command, but it's not dislocated from his nature, because it's in line with who he is. Who is he? So in the Islamic narrative, it's based upon his names and attributes. He is the knowing, the loving, the merciful, the wise, and so on and so forth. So it's not arbitrary, and goodness is not external. You know the argument yourself, right? So
sounds like William Lane Craig.
It is. It's very similar to that, but there's also basically what you call a metaphysical stopping point, because as you know, in metaphysics, is based on first principles. You can't continue the regress. You need a metaphysical framework to try and understand the moral reality, if and only if you believe that there are morals that are external to the human mind, the mind independent, which is a more realist position. But that is for another day for sure.
Sorry, I've dragged you off the subject. I apologize.
Yeah. So that would be kind of a quasi summary. There's much more nuances even within the Islamic tradition, and I think this is good. It's a very good question because it shows that.
Yeah. Sorry that I just chucked a massive spanner in the works.
Yeah, but it shows Islamic philosophy is actually quite nuanced and it's broad and lots of discussions on these issues. Anyway, so what's the time?
It's probably time to stop. I feel.
So, Doctor.
I imagine that I don't know if we've shed very much light on anything here, but I think I've got a slightly clearer view of where you're coming from.
Human dignity.
Yeah, no, I understand that, and I mean, and who's against that? Nobody. It's like apple pie, isn't it? Human dignity sums up all around. Now we're all in favour of human dignity and respecting people's human dignity. I'm just not convinced that the right way to do that is to introduce laws that effectively ban people from, satirizing, mocking, and so on. Admittedly, David Cameron's dignity is somewhat dented by Steve Bell's cartoons, but I don't really have a problem with that, and I don't have a problem with. I happen to lean towards Jeremy Corbyn's politics, as you know, and I don't have a problem with people satirizing and mocking him in that way either. And I think it would be a very dangerous development to have someone step in and say, sorry, we're introducing laws which mean that, to protect human dignity, you're not going to be allowed to say these things and present these arguments and so on. I think that would be, it's just too dangerous and too nebulous. I mean, some people really are awful. Some people really do have dangerous political views, and it's right that we should point a finger at them and say, this is absolutely outrageous. This is racist. This is not on. And if somebody says, oh no, hang on, Stephen, I think you'll find you're infringing their human dignity at this point by accusing them of racism. I'm going to be in a lot of trouble. By introducing this piece of legislation, it seems to me that you've basically given the powers that be the ability to interpret it in pretty much any way they want, to silence these people, to give those people a voice, and so on. It's just too nebulous. It's unenforceable. It's either unenforceable or it will be enforced in the most authoritarian and unpleasant ways by the most powerful people. So I just can't support it.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't even advise having these laws in our current secular paradigm anyway, because as you know, politicians, frankly, unfortunately, they seem to not have the kind of ethical foundation to even be able to apply these laws in a way that I would deem ethical. So I do empathize with what you're saying. If we were to apply these laws in this context, it would be crazy. But then I said the door does swing the other way as well, because if you just lay it as it is at the moment, then the problem is then you'll end up having things that are a negation of the very objectives of freedom of speech, like truth, accountability, and progress, like we saw in the case with Jeremy Corbyn in terms of the truth. And remember, you need to define mockery. Forget lampooning and mockery. In some contexts, it's fine. So there's two types of mockery, isn't there? As I said before, there's actually dealing with ideas and actions and actually dealing with people. So there is a subtle difference. And you could easily articulate a case for one of them. And that could be linked to someone's dignity. And it already exists in law. That's the thing. It exists in British law. There's things to do with insult and offense and intent. It already exists, Doctor. So the thing is, this is not, and what I'm saying is not uncontroversial and it's not authoritarian. It's only authoritarian if you assume that any type of criticism is going to be banned. No, I'm not saying that at all. And I want to be very clear.
Well, no, it's not that I assumed that all criticism of anyone would be banned. It's just that currently it's just too nebulous. I don't even really, at this point, I'm not entirely sure what it is that we're restricting and how we're restricting it. It's just that we have to respect people's dignity. Well, okay, but, that bloke really is an awful anti-Muslim racist. And by saying that, I am impugning his dignity. So am I not allowed to say it? And who's going to decide whether I'm allowed to say this or not? It's much better, it seems to me, that, you let him express his views up to a point, as long as he's not actually inciting hatred and so on against the particular community.
Well,
and we will respond, and we will ensure that we live in a society in which I think we're on the same page that there is a real problem with a few powerful individuals being able to shape the narrative about human beings, and in many cases really misrepresenting them and smearing them, and there's no pushback at all because they have the megaphone, no one else. I think we're agreed about that. We're just disagreeing about what the best way forward is. Would that be? Maybe we should. Maybe that's a good place to stop. We can at least agree about that much. And we've also kind of agreed on the principle of consistency, which is that, I started off with political secularism and saying, I don't think that religious beliefs should be given any special treatment. I don't understand why. I mean, I understand that very often they're related to a sense of identity and people feel very strongly about them and so on. But that's also true of many political beliefs. And I don't think that just because the beliefs are religious that they should get special privileges and special protections and so on. And it sounds to me like you agree with me about that. So maybe we actually agree about quite a lot.
Well, the good thing that what I've captured from this is that obviously we agree that freedom of speech is not absolute. Freedom of speech, when it's restricted, has to be contingent on certain values, a competing set of values, as David Van Mill said. And that's what the main discussion has been about, is your ethics and your values. How do you ground them, and how do you use them and apply them, and how do you link them to law? So where I think our difference has come across is from the perspective of diminishing the dignity of others. It already exists in law in different language, so it's not kind of, neither here or there. And I would even say it's not even authoritarian, because remember, as we said, the door can swing the other way as well. But we could talk about this until the cows come home, the philosophical cows come home. So what I would say is, first and foremost, huge thank you for your time. The most important thing I think that we have is time, because if I said you had 10 minutes left to live, and in order to get another 10 days, you have to give me all of your wealth, I think you would give me all of your wealth. So you gave me an hour and a half of your time, and I'm extremely grateful for that. And I don't want this to be the end. I think we should. I did my thesis on the philosophy of the mind, on the hard problem of consciousness. I would love to get you ideas on that. Let's talk about that maybe one day. It would be great to do so, and hopefully when this COVID mess is gone, we could do it face to face. But yeah, thank you for participating. I really want you back again. And, I could even come to your platforms one day as well, because I think what, if anything, is very important. And obviously I'm going to bring a religious discourse here. The Quran says that we were created from male and female, made into different tribes and nations in order to know one another. لِتَعَارَفُوا. Now, people think this means to know what makes us the same. The Quran is saying, no, trying to find out what makes you different. Because really, we need to be brave now. It's the differences that cause the fear and the anxiety. If you educate on the differences, even if you disagree with them, at least you might see some relevance or some humanity behind them, or you'll be able to see their paradigm. And that would at least diminish some fear and anxiety. So if anything that has happened today, it's that we're able to discuss what makes our certain values distinct. We've agreed on a lot as well. And I think what is shown to people, Muslims and non-Muslims, that we can have these conversations without diminishing our dignity from that perspective.
Yeah.
So,
I'll
give you the last sentence. Say bye-bye to everybody. And
oh, okay. Well, thank you very much. That was really enjoyable. I've only just noticed that there are lots of comments being made. I should have clicked the link and seen those earlier on. I might have responded to some of them had I. So I didn't. So I apologise for that. Though I should have been paying attention. But anyway, it was fun, and yeah, I enjoyed it. And yeah, maybe we'll do it again.
Yeah, there's lots to unpack for another time, and definitely thank you very much for your time, Dr. Stephen. You take care of yourself. Stay safe.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Bye-bye.
Bye.